section of this book was on sustainable development. For those who maybe don't know or don't remember, how would you define sustainable development, particularly since you're going to many of the United Nations conferences? And I know sustainable development largely came out of the Earth Summit in the early 90s with people like Stephen Rockefeller, Miguel Gorbachev, Maurice Strong. So since you're going to these conferences, you hear them talk about it. How do they define sustainable development?
Well, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I was at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. That was exactly 20 years after their original Earth Summit, where they came out with Agenda 21. And they had a picture there that was probably worth 1,000,000 words. It was an anthropomorphic Earth, so it was an Earth with a face, a human face, and it had a thermometer sticking out of its mouth. It was very clearly ill. It had a fever and everything. And the doctor comes in this poster and says, "I know your problem. You have humans." And I think that perfectly encapsulates this UN ideology called sustainable development. It's basically, take what God told people in Genesis: be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, flip it exactly upside down, don't be fruitful, don't even think about multiplying, and subduing the earth is completely out of the question. You might hurt a lizard or a cockroach or something. Don't even think about it. And I think that really encapsulates sustainable development. It is essentially a recipe for global totalitarianism masquerading as an environmental program. And officially they say, well, it's just to ensure that we have enough resources and we don't hurt the planet for future generations. But really, when you read through their own documents, this is obviously just a pretext to restrict freedom, undermine the nation state, and move us toward this one world order that at this point they openly talk about.
And those are the words of Henry Kissinger. These are the words of George H. Bush. These are the words of Henry Kissinger. The New World Order is not our description. That's their description. I'm sure you, like myself, we get blamed for being into conspiracy theories, when reality is, if you start back with my first book in 1993, my second book in 1995, and come forward, now working on my 15th book, a lot of the trends that we said were upon us at the time those books were being written, and then I said, here's what this will naturally lead to, those things have come true, and many of them have come true beyond what we even predicted. Now, our critics want to say we're conspiracy theorists, but reality is their ignorance doesn't make us into conspiracy theorists. It just makes them ignorant. Reality is there are a group of people that are indeed conspiring to carry out global policies. But these conspiracy theories, as they want to call them, they've actually come to pass. You and I have made predictions on trends and policy, and they can go back in our past articles and books and see the things that we wrote about, they've actually come to pass.
That's right, Brandon. It really is fascinating. I go back and I read issues of the New American Magazine from 20, 25, 30 years ago, and it's like those guys had a crystal ball. I'm thinking, what in the world? If we had been reading these things 20, 25 years ago, we wouldn't be here. And it is, I think, fascinating that people still throw out that term conspiracy theorist when you're talking about documented facts. I mean, there's a real distinction between a theory and a fact. George H.W. Bush went on national television and announced to the world that he was building a, quote, new world order, and then he defined it for us. He said it would be a world in which a credible United Nations would use its peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And if you unpack that, he'd let the cat out of the bag. He's talking about the UN's peacekeeping role. Really, they're talking about the UN's military forces. Estimates from the group Hear Their Cries suggest that these UN peace troops have raped something along the order of 60,000 women and children just in the last decade. So these are not peace troops. These are war-making, atrocity-committing people with heavy weaponry wearing little blue helmets. And so George Bush said, we're going to use this peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And we know quite a bit about the UN's founders. This is not a mystery. We know, for example, that they were openly plotting the creation of a world government. We have John Foster Dulles as one example, a crucial architect of the United Nations, served as Secretary of State, and he wrote in his book, War or Peace, there's no proposal for a world government that couldn't be brought about using the existing UN Charter. On the other side, we had Joseph Stalin, who, of course, was very interested in creating a world government as well, a communist, brutal, totalitarian world government. And then on our side, to come back to the United States, we sent a guy called Alger Hiss, and they loved him so much they actually made him the first Secretary General of the UN and of the conference that created the UN. And a few years later, we put him in federal prison because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So why Bush would talk openly about building a new world order based on the vision of these UN founders instead of respecting the vision of our American founders is, to me, just absolutely flabbergasting. And then for someone to come along and say that's a conspiracy theory, no. All you need to do is go to YouTube and watch George Bush say this, or you can watch Bill Clinton say it. He said, I agree with George Bush on the need for a new world order, or Joseph Biden, or Henry Kissinger, or Prime Minister Tony Blair, or, take your pick of world leaders. You have George Soros, just in recent years has been running around the world saying we need, quote, a new world order, and that communist China ought to own the new world order in the same way that the United States owned the old world order. So these people are now very open about this. And again, I think it goes back to the fact that they're so confident of success because they've got all our kids in their classrooms.
And so to push global governance, giving up of national state sovereignty, going perhaps to a global world court that has more and more control as we have a world court. Of course, Donald Trump has recently come against the world court, kind of pulled America out of a world court. So again, it's this battle going on between those who want to be nation states and those who want to go into globalism. But they're using environmentalism. Now we have AOC, this Cortez lady, this young gal in her 20s who's an outright cultural Marxist, socialist, and they got the Democrats in their green bill. And so really sustainable development is using environmentalism as a mask or a cover or a wrapping for international socialism. Would you agree that globalism is indeed just international socialism?
It is. And I think, at their core, all of these ideologies, and what you see is globalism and socialism and humanism, all of these kind of meld into one common source. And I think that's what we should expect from reading the Bible. But what they all have in common is this desire to create a global system of total control over our lives. And at this point, again, they don't even bother hiding it. They do use environmentalism as a pretext. They do say that this is to save us from climate change or to save us from, pick your environmental issue. But when you actually read their documents, they're quite transparent that this is really socialism. This is globalism. Take, for example, the Agenda 2030. They tell you right in there that we need wealth redistribution at the national and the international level. They say that we need the wealth to be cooperatively shared. They say that we need to use the education system to bring all of this about. And so there's a really great term that's been floating around for a few years now, the idea that these people are watermelons. They're green on the outside, but they're red on the inside. And it's just a brilliant description because they're using these environmental concerns, some of which are completely fabricated, some of which have some legitimacy. Everybody wants clean air, clean water, and so on. But they're using that as a pretext to undermine our freedom, to take our money, to create a global system of taxation and regulation. I mean, they're at the point now, Brandon, where they're calling the gas that we exhale, carbon dioxide, a toxic pollution that needs to be regulated and taxed by the United Nations. That's how extreme this has gotten. And environmentalism, again, is just a pretext for bringing about this vision that they have.
In fact, they even admit that. The Commission on Global Governance, an organization tied to the United Nations, I quote them in my book, Grave Influence, from 2008, and here's what they wrote. Quote, the environment, perhaps more than any other issue, has helped to crystallize the notion that humanity has a common future. The concept of sustainable development is now widely used and accepted as a framework within which all countries, rich and poor, should operate. The aspect that particularly concerns us is the global governance implications, end quote. So there is the Commission on Global Governance aligned with the United Nations admitting they're using sustainable development as the framework for bringing about global governance. In other words, radical environmentalism, sustainable development, Agenda 21, now called Agenda 2030, is simply using that to bring about world government.
That's exactly what's happening. And again, when you read their documents, you just see this so clearly. A lot of the people who've been pushing this have also been very open about admitting this. I quote David Rockefeller often. He wrote in his memoirs, the late David Rockefeller, he went to go meet his maker a couple years ago, and I can't imagine that went very well, but that's between him and God. But he wrote in his memoirs before he died Some people accuse me of being a conspirator, working with other internationalists, a secret cabal of internationalists around the world against the best interests of my own country, to build a one world order with an integrated global economy and political system. And he said, if that's the charge, I'm proud of it. And what you see is that David Rockefeller and all these organizations that he either created or helped lead, groups like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, what you see is they all have this idea in common that, hey, we need to globalize political problems and environmental problems as a pretext to bring about this one world order. So, the climate change issue is so perfect for them, because what they say is, hey, climate change doesn't respect borders. This is a global problem, and when you have a global problem, you need to have global political solutions. So it is very transparently a pretext. They don't even bother to conceal it anymore. And if we allow them to get their way on this, it will be the end of freedom and the end of America as we have known it.
Absolutely. Maurice Strong, who helped head up the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, said this, quote, "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?" End quote. And then here we have this, quote, "It is simply not feasible for sovereignty to be exercised unilaterally by individual nation states, however powerful. It is a principle which will yield only slowly and reluctantly to the imperatives of global environmental cooperation," end quote. There's Maurice Strong of the Earth Summit again saying we're going to use environmentalism to bring about world government. Or how about Helen Caldicott of the Union of Concerned Scientists, when she declared, quote, "Free enterprise really means rich people get richer. They have the freedom to exploit and psychologically rape their fellow human beings in the process. Capitalism is destroying the earth," end quote. Again, coming out of my book, Grave Influence from 2008. So now that we see this millennial generation fully indoctrinated through our educational system into global warming myths and other junk science, no wonder someone like AOC, or the U.S. Congresswoman from New York, Cortez, as her name is, Cortez, no wonder she can gain such a humongous following on social media. And this is the future of our elected officials, because they've been brainwashed in our schools to buy into this trash.
That is exactly what we're dealing with right now. And if you look at the polls, the latest polls show a majority of young Americans support socialism over free markets. This is a very dangerous trend. It's getting worse. It's happening around the world. Of course, the UN is now involved in education all over the world. And, the kind of global government that they're looking for, the kind of global system that they're indoctrinating children to accept, is very transparently totalitarian. To go back to this UN conference on sustainable development that I went to in Rio de Janeiro, they didn't bother to hide it. The chairman of the conference was literally a Chinese communist. His name was Xia Zhakung, a representative of the most murderous dictatorship to ever curse this planet, the mass murdering regime in China, which murdered 80 million of its own citizens at least, not including the maybe hundreds of millions that they've murdered through forced abortions and coercive population control policies. So why would you put somebody like that in charge of the summit that's supposed to plan out the global environmental government? And, to add insult to injury here, Brandon, if you look around the world, there's a very, very clear link between environmental problems and totalitarian government. If you look at the most polluted nations in the world, you have the former Soviet Union, you have North Korea, you have communist China, you have Cuba. These are absolute wastelands, right? They've destroyed entire ecosystems with their failed central planning, with their harebrained ideas. And then you look at the cleanest societies, the most environmentally friendly societies on the planet, and without exception, they are all the most free market-oriented economies in the world, like Switzerland, parts of Western Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada. I mean, these are the countries that have had free markets, or at least more free market than these other states, and they are by far the cleanest. So under the guise of improving the environment, we're now moving toward a global model that has been shown consistently and repeatedly to be an absolute destroyer of the environment. So they really take us for fools, and I think the only reason they can get away with this is because they have the children in the schools.
Absolutely. Well, the first Earth Summit was held in Rio in 1992, and you went back to the next Earth Summit held in Rio in 2012, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And what were they saying? Are they happy with the schedule? Are they behind schedule? Are they ahead of schedule? Why did they call it Agenda 21 and then change the name to Agenda 2030?
Well, they always feel like they're behind schedule, and I think they are behind schedule, because if they had gotten their way, we would have already been involved in this totalitarian global government many decades ago. And fortunately, mostly Americans have pushed back to such an extent that they've had to continue delaying their plans. Now their newest talking point, and we saw Ocasio-Cortez blabbering about this, is that we only have 12 years or we're all doomed. And so we see this periodically. They say, you only have 10 years left to save the planet or we're all going to die. 10 years comes and goes. Then they put out a new deadline. So, they obviously want to accelerate the process, but at the same time, it's like boiling a frog, to use a cliche, overused analogy. If you heat it up too quickly, the frog will jump out and your plan gets ruined. So you got to do it at a rate that doesn't alarm the population so much that they'll put a stop to it. And I think that's what we've been seeing. So Agenda 21 really got the ball rolling. If you read Agenda 21, Chapter 36, for example, deals with education, and they were openly putting this in all the schools. You had Education Secretary Arne Duncan under the Obama administration openly bragging in speeches to UNESCO and in speeches here in the United States. He said, we're infusing sustainability into every element of the curriculum, from kindergarten through university. We're using the schools to create green global citizens. Of course, this is not why parents send their children to school, right? They normally think they're going there to learn how to read and write and so on. But this was exactly what was called for under Chapter 36 of Agenda 21. But then came Agenda 2030. This they agreed to a few years ago with the Pope's blessing at the UN General Assembly. Obama signed on to this. And now they're taking it to the next level, right? Now they're going from local government, kind of behind the scenes, to full-blown, in-your-face. Every national government in the world needs to be involved in this. Every regional government in the world, this is a key part of their strategy as well. The European Union, the African Union, the Union of South American States. Putin is building the Eurasian Union. And so they want all of these higher levels of government also involved now, beyond just the local and state governments. And they're moving forward very quickly. Again, in Agenda 2030, Chapter 4 deals with education, and they spell out very explicitly there that every child needs to have the quote-unquote education that will prepare them not just to accept sustainable development or to even just peacefully submit to it, but to go out and promote it. And so they need to have a gender equality education, which really is code word for radical feminism and destroying the family, getting women out into the workforce to the largest extent possible so that children can be put with the government at earlier and earlier ages, education in global citizenship, appreciation for diversity, which is really the destruction of diversity, right? The homogenization of every country in the world, the destruction of real diversity. So they spell it all out for you right there. They say children are critical agents of change that are going to bring about this vision. And to do that, see goal number 4, where we're going to outline the education. So the education component of it is so critical. It's not possible to accomplish this without it, and they recognize that.
And Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, they've given extensive speeches calling for world government, a central global power with teeth, a world central bank with teeth. In fact, one of the Pope's speechwriters is just a blatant socialist and globalist and radical environmentalist. So these different speeches that Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have given, Pope Francis quoting Pope Benedict, are about as radical as you can get as far as calling for world government and using sustainable development and redistribution of wealth from rich countries to poor countries. I mean, they don't hide it. Now they've got the Pope on their side.
That's right. Just very recently, they had the latest edition of the World Government Summit in the United Arab Emirates, where I've spent some time. And there was no coverage of this in the American media, almost nothing. Even though CNN was a co-sponsor of the event, Sky News, which is owned by the parent company of Fox News, yet the New York Times was a sponsor, not a peep about this World Government Summit. And yet the Pope addressed this World Government Summit. He blessed their efforts. He called for sustainable development with solidarity. And you had the heads of the United Nations, all the UN's agencies, the International Monetary Fund, which of course they're grooming to become the global central bank, the World Bank, Communist Chinese operatives, on and on, famous Hollywood actors. I mean, you would think this would be front page news in every country in the world, and yet not a peep. And, they also, again, are very transparent about their agenda, Brandon. A couple years ago, in 2017, they had the World Government Summit, and they literally erected an arch of Baal Baal from the Bible, with his child sacrifices, and, God was not happy about this. And so they put up a replica arch of Baal at this World Government Summit. And this is what the Pope came and gave his blessing to in 2019, this effort to create global sustainable development through the World Government Summit. And, they're coming out of the closet and they're in your face about it. They won't tell you about it on the front page of the newspaper, even if the newspaper is sponsoring the summit. But it's out there. It's happening. You can see it all. There's no more theorizing. This is exactly what the Bible told us would happen, and this is exactly what we see happening right now.
And they love to use religious symbolism, as you said, twisted scripture as well as religious symbolism. Remember when, was it Stephen Rockefeller back at the Earth Summit in Rio, and then they're bringing out the Ark of Hope, which was to be kind of a model of the Ark of the Covenant that carried the Ten Commandments, but the Ark of Hope with all of its pagan artwork on it was really about a global Ten Commandments, and I think they took that to the United Nations for a while and then took it on tour around the world. Remember their symbolism of the Ark of Hope?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And they literally said, I think it was Mikhail Gorbachev, the former dictator of the Soviet Union, said, we want this to be like the new 10 commandments for the environment. I mean, it just is so brazen, so in your face.
Well, speaking of Mikhail Gorbachev, here's one of the things he said, quote, "First of all, we must return to the well-known human values that are embodied in the ideals of the world religions, and also in the socialist ideas that inherited much more from those values. Further, we need to search for a new paradigm of development that is based on those values and that is capable of leading us toward a genuinely humanistic, or more precisely, humanistic ecological culture of living," end quote. So again, Mikhail Gorbachev is not hiding his desire for a new religious system based on environmentalism mixed with religion. Let's talk quickly before we move into border crisis and other things. Let's talk about the International Baccalaureate. I saw an article this week here in 2019, March of 2019, where the Democrats are wanting more funding for our federal Department of Education to indoctrinate kids in global warming and radical environmentalism K through 12. Well, that's going to continue, that trend, of course, not to mention we've got the Department of Education also funding radical environmentalism. So you have that red-green axis, the red being the Marxism, the green being the green of the Islamic flag. So our Department of Education now is funding both sides. They're funding classes on Islam, and they're funding classes on radical environmentalism and other things that promote the socialism. So that's that red-green axis right in our own government. Again, kind of fits with our movie, Sabotage, which was all about the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood in their Muslim explanatory memorandum said, we will get Americans to sabotage their own house from within, destroy their own country by their own hands. Well, we're clearly doing that. But we also have had for a lot of years something known as International Baccalaureate schools. These are United Nations schools that are all over the world, but we have many, many of them in the United States. I'm talking well over 1,000 now, I believe, if not higher. And even in the South, where people think, they're so conservative and they're for national sovereignty, they're against globalism, they're against socialism, and yet what do we find in the South? International Baccalaureate schools, and all these so-called conservative parents are so happy to have their kids go to these IB schools because it looks so good on their high school transcript to go on to the best college. And they're nothing more than UN schools where they teach the UN Charter, sustainable development, global governance, feminism, destruction of our national sovereignty, multiculturalism, a denigration of our foundational Western worldview. And so we've got UN schools all over the U.S. training what are some of our brightest kids, correct?
That's exactly right. And in fact, I kind of grew up in this environment. I went to very elite international schools in Mexico, Brazil, Switzerland. And so I was kind of always immersed in this UN, this International Baccalaureate, this globalism. And it is now in America. In fact, the UN has a whole agency dedicated to education. It's called the UNESCO. Fortunately, Trump has withdrawn from this, which is a very good thing. But the threat from UNESCO is far from over. And a lot of people don't realize the United Nations, the UNESCO, actually has a set of global standards and a global curriculum that they want used in every school in the world. First of all, they have global sex education standards. They just released the latest version. This calls for teaching 5-year-olds things that are just unspeakable. I won't even say them here because they're so inappropriate and evil. They also have what they call the World Core Curriculum. Now, on this point, the rabbit hole goes really deep. The author of these standards, the World Core Curriculum, his name was Robert Mueller. He was an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and he was pretty open about his views. Actually, I have the teacher's manual for the World Core Curriculum, and he tells you right in there that these standards, this curriculum, is based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, more specifically the Tibetan, which was a quote-unquote spiritual entity that would take control of Alice Bailey's body and write these very bizarre books like Education in the New Age and Externalization of the Hierarchy. If you actually read what was written, and I mean, any Christian who reads their Bible would recognize instantly that we're talking about demonic forces here. These are not spiritual gurus and ascended masters like they like to say. And the agenda was very transparent. She writes in these, or her spirit entities write in these books, that we're going to move toward a global religion under the United Nations, where all the churches are going to come together, and they're finally going to exterminate what they call this heresy of separateness, which is, of course, biblical Christianity, Orthodox Jews, other people who maybe don't want to participate in this system. And again, the guy who wrote the World Core Curriculum bragged that his World Core Curriculum was based on these teachings. Alice Bailey was actually the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company, as if, they didn't really try to hide what the agenda was here. And that is the agenda. If you look at what Robert Mueller was saying, the author of this World Core Curriculum, he was very transparent. He actually called the United Nations the body of Christ. I mean, talk about blasphemy. We know the church is the body of Christ, not the United Nations, not the dictators club that is the United Nations. But this educational ideology, this educational spirituality has now infiltrated government schools all over the world. This is provable. They brag about this. The recently departed head of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, an actual Communist Party member from Bulgaria. She served a regime that murdered hundreds of thousands of people. I was getting press releases in my inbox from her office saying, we're going to teach the kids a new spirituality. We're going to give them new values and attitudes and beliefs so that they're ready to be global citizens. So they're coming out of the closet on this. They are preparing our children for something that is unspeakably horrifying.
Everything he just said about Alice Bailey and Robert Mueller is in my book, Grave Influence, written in 2008, came out in 2009. And yet, Alex and I did not plan to talk about this. This is my first time ever to interview Alex, and yet everything he just said to you about Alice Bailey, Robert Mueller, the Global Education Plan, and the UN is 100% true. It's in my book, Grave Influence. She was indeed, as you know, a whole chapter on Grave Influence on Alice Bailey, channeling a demon, the Tibetan. They wrote over 10,000 pages together. She openly called for doing away with the old rhythms of religion, getting away from Christianity, destroying Christianity. She praised Adolf Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and many others as people that were bringing about the great change that needed to be brought about. Her demon she channeled, the Tibetan, openly called for a new world order. I mean, she wrote extensively on these things. And as you know, I wrote about Alice Bailey in my book, The Coming Religious Reich, as well as in my book, Marxianity. What Alice Bailey went on to talk about, which I wrote in my book, Marxianity, is that world government would come about through government, corporations, and religion. Corporations, government, and religion. The three-legged stool that's been promoted by Rick Warren, Bill Hybels, Bob Buford, Peter Drucker, Tim Keller, the Gospel Coalition. I think really what Alice Bailey was predicting with her demon is what we see in Revelation chapter 17 and Revelation chapter 18 there in Babylon, 58 miles south of Baghdad. And if you read chapter 17 and 18, particularly chapter 18 of Revelation, you see that. World government, big business, corporations, and religion. So it's got government, corporations, and religion, the three-legged stool. Well, Alice Bailey with her demons said that's how they were going to bring about that. And what do we see today? Emerging a big government, big business, and now a religious facade wrapped around it. Big government, big business, and a religious facade wrapped around it. And Robert Mueller at the UN, Assistant Secretary General of the UN, he was known as the father of global education, an occultist, liking Alice Bailey, the demon. He actually started a school to teach teachers on how to teach Alice Bailey's occultism to our school kids. So again, this shows you the fact that even evangelicalism is buying into, I believe, a demonic plan, as you got guys like Tim Keller, the Gospel Coalition, Rick Warren, Peter Drucker, Bob Buford, Bill Hybels, pushing the three-legged stool, this communitarianism, which really is tied all the way back to the UN and global governance. Agree or disagree?
That's exactly what's happening, Brandon. And when you go to these UN conferences, you can't escape it, right? For example, this one that I just went to in Poland, in Katowice, the UN COP24. Again, almost no media coverage in the United States. That's exactly what it was. Big government, right? Every government in the world was represented there, including, unfortunately, ours. You also had big business there. You had all the mega banks bragging about how they were all on board. You had all the big oil companies, right? Shell and BP. And then you had the religious figures. A very high-level Vatican functionary came. I actually interviewed him. The video is on YouTube. We had a bishop from the Episcopal Church. Same thing. I interviewed him. And I actually offered him the opportunity. I said, hey, tell people, why should they believe in Christ? And instead of preaching the gospel to people, I had him on camera. I said, here's your opportunity. Tell everyone, why should they believe the Bible? Why should they follow Jesus? Why should they accept Jesus Christ? He said, well, that's right for me, but, everybody has their own thing. And I was thinking, oh, my goodness, I cannot believe I just heard that. So we have a situation now where what Alice Bailey described, what Robert Mueller described, all of this is now coming about. You can see it clearly at these UN conferences. They don't even bother to hide it. And, I think the only thing right now standing between them and their little plan and their objective, being able to succeed, is the American people and especially the Christian church.
And yet, evangelicalism is being infiltrated by this with
That's
the
right.
likes of the Gospel Coalition, which I call the Cultural Marxist Gospel Coalition. Guys like Al Mohler and Lyndon Duncan and Mark Dever and Tim Keller and Russell Moore and D.A. Carson. And they're all pushing... you go to the Gospel Coalition website, they're pushing reparations, they're pushing voting for Hillary back in the last election against Donald Trump, they're pushing for mandatory minimum incomes, they're praising social justice, they're pushing amnesty. You got Russell Moore, part of the Gospel Coalition, and he's with the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission as of today, 2019. And what is he a part of? He's part of George Soros's Evangelical Immigration Roundtable. So again, I think evangelicalism is the last line of defense, but it's been highly infiltrated, which is why I wrote the book Religious Trojan Horse so many years ago, and then the book The Coming Religious Reich, because they're hijacking evangelicalism. And I've even have people who are former CIA agent tell me of a high-ranking person with Muslim Brotherhood talking about evangelicalism is really the last line of defense. If they can grab that group, they've got it. So the cultural Marxists, the Reds, and the Greens, the Islamists, are all going after evangelicalism, and I would say they're well on their way to taking evangelicalism down.
I think you're right, Brandon. And I wrote an article about the latest Southern Baptist Convention where they elected J.D. Greear, and I highlighted exactly what you're talking about right now. You have a concerted international effort to infiltrate and subvert evangelical churches, Orthodox churches. I wrote an article about how George Soros was funding these training programs. He had actually hijacked a bunch of tax money from some of the Western European governments to fund these training programs for some of the Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe, where they were training pastors to support homosexuality, support globalism, support the European Union. We see the same thing happening here in the United States with the subversion and infiltration of our churches.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and again, we go into a whole hour of this in the movie Sabotage, and my book Marxianity is all about what we've been talking about with Alex Newman here in the last few minutes about socialism, globalism, the LGBT community coming into evangelicalism. And what I'm finding, Alex, is you have guys like Al Mohler and Mark Dever and Tim Keller and others with the Gospel Coalition promoting the whole LGBTQ agenda. They have tests that they've endorsed or been a part of, or surveys, the LGBTQ survey by Sam Alberry, an Anglican gay priest, just determine whether your church is inclusive when it comes to the LGBTQ community. And by inclusive, they don't mean just being nice to them, which we should be nice to people. We should be loving and kind, but we don't have to accept their lifestyle. We don't have to embrace their lifestyle any more than we would embrace the corrupt lifestyle of someone that was a heterosexual. We can still be kind and loving, but we don't have to endorse it or find value in it. And yet that's what the whole LGBTQ inclusive survey was about. Are you including them in the life of the church? Participation, worship leaders, on staff, members, active members, despite the fact what the Bible talks about is criteria for being an elder or a leader or a pastor or even a church member. And so the question is, why are these evangelical groups pushing the globalist LGBTQ agenda? And I believe, Alex, what we're talking about here is the family is under siege, the churches are under siege, and our Christian worldview as a nation, as a constitutional republic, is under siege. And they're going to wrap their Marxism with environmentalism. They're going to wrap their Marxism with feminism. They're going to wrap their Marxism with immigration issues. They're going to wrap their Marxism with LGBTQ. In other words, they've got to create a coalition of victims, as Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School said. And so once they create their coalition of victims, the poor, immigrants, the sexual minorities, as they call them, feminists, then they turn and say, well, who's the problem? Who is the ones victimizing these people? And they turn and they say, oh, it's the Christians and the capitalists. So in other words, the source of all suffering and oppression is Christianity and capitalism. So Christianity and capitalism is under siege to prove that they're the ones who are really the source of all suffering and oppression. Now we have so-called evangelicals pushing the LGBTQ agenda into the church, and that yet when we respond and say, wait a minute, there are criteria according to the Bible for these issues, we look like the bigots, the haters, the intolerant, and so we get set up to be the enemy. But the question is, why are these so-called evangelical groups doing this? I go back to the old thing of follow the money. And what I'm finding is some of the globalist foundations and groups supporting some of these religious people and figures, I think they're behind the LGBTQ agenda as a form of Marxism. Let's destroy the family. As Herbert Marcuse said, we must attack the existing morality of the culture and destroy it. If you don't have a mom and dad, if you don't have families, you don't have an incubator for passing on a capitalist constitutional republic system anymore. To disciple and make as an incubator the home for people who are responsible adults and capitalists. If you can destroy the family by destroying marriage, the biblical roles of men and women, sexuality, if you destroy the idea of sexuality through the LGBTQ community, you're on your way to destroying the family. Without families, we don't really have a country anymore. We don't have an incubator for passing on a constitutional republic and men and women of character and leadership to maintain this. Because as William Blackstone said, the leading scholar for the Founding Fathers, when asked what is a constitutional republic, he said, what the divine has ruled on, we don't rule against. Well, if you don't have people following what the divine or the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments have taught, then you don't have a constitutional republic anymore. So I'm wondering if there's follow the money. These religious leaders and organizations, even within so-called mainstream evangelicalism, if they don't prove they're pushing environmentalism, immigration, radical immigration policies, amnesty, and now the LGBTQ community ideas, they won't get any money. I think this has become a litmus test to see if they will do what they're told, and if they do, they get money. If they don't, they won't get money. What say you?
Precisely. You know, we see now, even unfortunately, some of the churches following doctrines of demons. We see, false prophets and the Antichrist spirit infiltrating the churches. And I think really it goes back to Ephesians 6:12. You know, God tells us that we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, spiritual wickedness and darkness in high places. And I think that's why this has been able to advance so far, because the Bible is crystal clear on these things. You know, some of these evangelical churches, so-called, that are claiming that homosexuality is a part of your identity, that you were born a homosexual, and that it's unchangeable. I mean, that's simply nonsense. Just open up your Bible and see what Paul had to say about it. Homosexuals, such were some of you. Clearly, the Bible is telling us that homosexuality is not who you are. It is not God's design for you. It is a sin that can be left in the past. And yet now to say that, this was generally understood across Western civilization and across much of the world. I mean, this is something you don't even need divine revelation to understand. You can just glean this from creation. I mean, this is something that God has revealed to everyone. And yet now we see this effort to undermine, and we see the effort to demonize people who point out this obvious reality. And I think what we're seeing, Brandon, in all of these things, is a war on everything that God has ordained. I mean, God's word is under siege, and what God has ordained is under siege. You have, for example, God ordained private property. He said, "Thou shalt not steal," which implies a right to property. You can't steal something if someone doesn't own something. And so we see a war on